Hey, welcome to section 2.3. We're going to be talking about infection cycles and disease transmission. So we're going to try my little picture guide here in the corner. He might get deleted by the time we get through this lecture. Okay, so before we start section 2.3, let's answer a review question. So Maydew comes to the clinic experiencing a fever, rash, and high blood pressure. He's experiencing which of the following? A, symptoms, B, signs, C, symptoms and signs, or D, a syndrome. Okay, so take a second and pause the video and see if you can figure out what the answer is. Okay, let's see if we can figure this out. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remember what signs and symptoms are. So remember, signs are traits of the disease that we can find from an external physical examination. Okay, so we can see these things with our eyes, we can feel them with touch. Okay, well, on the other hand, symptoms, this is going to be something that only the patient feels. This is going to be things like headaches. This is going to be fatigue. So these are all internal factors and not external ones like signs. So what we're going to do is these three items, we are going to figure out if they're either a sign or a symptom. So fever, this is going to be a sign, right? Because the first thing your mom does when you tell her you're feeling sick is she's going to put her hand against your forehead to feel for a fever. Okay, so fever is a sign. Rash, this is also a sign, right? This is something that we can see with our eyes in an external examination. Okay, the hardest one of these three would be high blood pressure. So is this a sign or a symptom? How do we determine if somebody has high blood pressure? Well, we're going to use a physical examination. We're going to get the blood pressure cuff out. We're going to put it on and we are going to physically measure their blood pressure. Okay, since it's something we can find in a physical examination, high blood pressure is also a sign. So that makes this pretty easy. The answer to this question is B, signs. Okay, so our second objectives for 2.3 are to be able to describe a complex versus a simple infection cycle, be able to differentiate between endemic, epidemic, and pandemic diseases, and you need to be able to explain animal reservoirs and incubators. Okay, so let's start with a case history. Okay, so let's start the story with Emma Catherine. Emma Catherine is a 21-year-old college student who's attending college in Massachusetts. Okay, one day she's in class and she starts to feel sick. Okay, she has a fever coming on, she's starting to feel nauseous, she's getting a headache, and her body's starting to ache. So by the time class ends, Emma Catherine has determined that she doesn't want to finish her classes for the day, so she's going to go back to her dorm or residence hall and get some sleep. Okay, what she's feeling all points towards the flu virus. So that's what she thinks. She's like, I just had the flu, I can sleep it off. So she goes back to her dorm, goes to bed for the rest of the day and for the night. And in the morning she wakes up and when she looks at her arm, she notices something that wasn't there yesterday. She notices that she's developed a rash that is made up of small, flat, pink, non-itchy spots. Well, Emma Catherine kind of freaks out at this point because rashes aren't a normal sign of the flu, so she knows she has something else. Okay, so she gets ready and goes to the student health center. Okay, where she sees one of the physician assistants. Okay, the PA that's working with Emma asks her a bunch of questions, and one of the questions that he asks her is what kind of activities she's done in the past month. Well, this is the spring semester, so Emma Catherine a few weeks ago got done with spring break. So for spring break, her and some friends took a trip down to North Carolina, where she hiked and camped in the woods for a few days. Now, while she was camping, Emma did say that she had a friend notice that she had a tick on her back one morning, and that tick hadn't been there the night before. So the friend removed the tick and threw it into the woods, and they really didn't think anything of it past that point. Okay, so between Emma's signs and symptoms and her travel history to North Carolina, the PA is starting to suspect that Emma has Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, or RMSF. So Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever is kind of a misnomer. It does not is not caught anywhere in the Rocky Mountains. This is specifically an East Coast disease. Okay, so this disease is caused by a specific bacteria. It is caused by Rickettsia rickettsii. So the next thing the PA does is has Emma get a hold of the friends she went on the trip with and everyone she's come in contact with since she's gotten back from North Carolina and ask them if they have any of the signs and symptoms that she has. Well, come to find out that no one that Emma went to North Carolina with was showing RMSF or anybody that she had associated since coming back from her trip. Okay, so if nobody was showing these signs and symptoms, how did Emma get this disease? Well, I think it's pretty obvious where she got it. That tick that her friend had found on her back is the reason that she got Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. Okay, so Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever is a disease that is found in an animal reservoir. So it doesn't make the animal sick, but the animal can carry it. So what happens is an insect vector, such as the tick that got on Emma, will take a blood meal from the animal that's the reservoir, and then it will go and find another meal, say Emma, and take another blood meal. So what happens though when the tick took a blood meal from Emma, it regurgitated some of the blood from the animal reservoir, and which is contaminated with Rickettsia rickettsii, which is going to then get into Emma's bloodstream and cause the start of the infection. So this is how Emma came down with RMSF. Okay, so section 2.3 is all about modes of transmission. So how we spread disease. Okay, we have four modes. We have direct transmission, indirect transmission, vertical transmission, and vector transmission. These are all a little bit different, and you need to know all four of these. Okay, so direct transmission is also sometimes called direct contact transmission, and it is just like it sounds. You have direct contact with an animal or person with the disease, and they transmit it to you. Okay, this could be you talking to a friend, they cough into their hand, and then shake your hand. Okay, you can also get it from your pets or any animal reservoir with that disease, and just petting the cat will help transmit that disease to you. The second mode of transmission is indirect transmission. Okay, so we need a vehicle or an intermediary. So we need a middleman to transmit the disease. Okay, this is going to be by fomites, which is just a fancy word for inanimate objects like doorknobs or desks, food, contaminated water, and air. Okay, the third type of mode of transmission is a very specific one. It is vertical transmission. This is when a pregnant mom can transfer a disease or an infectious agent from her to her fetus. This is usually done through the placenta. Okay, so this is one we don't see a lot, but it is a mode of transmission. The last mode of transmission is vector transmission. This one's a little bit more complicated, and this is what we saw in Emma's story. So we're going to have an animal reservoir, whether it's a mouse or a deer or any other animal. These guys are going to be carrying the microbe that's going to cause disease. Now, these animal reservoirs are most of the time not sick, they're just carriers. So we're going to have a vector, like an insect vector, that is going to come and help spread the disease from these animal reservoirs to the humans. So say we have our good old mosquito here. He comes and lands on our deer and takes a blood meal from the deer. Now the mosquito is now full of this blood that's contaminated with this microbe. Okay, so the mosquito is going to go on, it's going to find its next blood meal. So if it lands on us, or this guy, it's going to take a blood meal. And when it's taking that blood meal, it's going to regurgitate or pass some of the deer's contaminated blood to you or any other human, which is then going to allow the infectious agent, the microbe, to get into your bloodstream, which is then going to cause infection and is then going to develop into the disease. Now, vector transmission doesn't always need an intermediary like an insect. It can simply be a mechanical vector like animal poop. Okay, so we have another table of terms. These ones are pretty important. I would read through them and know them. Okay, but I would definitely pay a lot of attention to vehicle transmission. So fomites. Fomites are just inanimate objects. Okay, I would look at vehicle. This is things like air, food, or any liquid, like water. Okay, we have vectors. Okay, these are living carriers of infectious disease. Okay, reservoir. These are going to be non-human, animal, plant, human, or environment that can harbor an organism. Okay, so the reservoir may not have the disease, but it could have the disease. Okay, so then we come into our different routes of transmission. So we have the fecal oral route. I would know this one. We have the urogenital route. This is how pathogens enter through the urethra or vagina. The parenteral route, this is a good one to know. This is when a pathogen enters the body through an insect bite or a needle injection. Okay, so this would cover Emma's experience with the tick. It would be she got the disease through the parenteral route. Um, let's go back to the fecal oral route. I forgot to explain it. This one's exactly like it says. Okay, so the pathogen exits a host through the feces. Okay, that those feces then can go and contaminate food if it's being used as manure. It can contaminate the water if it gets mixed in, or it can get onto an inanimate object. Okay, then the pathogen is going to be picked up by its new host and either through the contaminated food or water, or by using your hands that have touched the contaminated inanimate object, you're going to ingest that poop and introduce the pathogen to your system. Okay, these last three we'll talk more at the end of this section about what they exactly mean. These are all terms that we've heard quite a bit in the last 4 years. So we'll need to be able to tell the difference between an endemic, an epidemic, and a pandemic. Okay, so let's talk about the modes of transmission. So, how disease is transmitted, so the route it takes from one person or animal to another, is what we call an infection cycle. So, infection cycle of infection is pretty much the same thing. I will probably use cycle of infection more because that's the term I used and learned as a student. Okay, so all modes of transmission fall into two types, either horizontal transmission or vertical transmission. Okay, the simplest one is vertical transmission. This is just when the infectious agent is transferred from a parent to the offspring. Usually it goes from the pregnant mom to their fetus in the womb through the placenta. Okay, horizontal transmission is going to cover the other three modes of transmission that we've talked about. Okay, horizontal transmission is when an infectious agent is transferred from one person or an animal to the next person or animal. Okay, so direct transmission, indirect transmission, and vector transmission are all examples of horizontal transmission. Okay, so let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. Okay, cycles of infection can be pretty simple or complex. So direct contact transmission is a cycle of infection that's pretty simple. Okay, this is when we're going to spread an organism directly from person to person. This can happen by touching, by shaking hands, by kissing, sex. All of these are ways that this can happen. Okay, so the next set is modes of transmission. So we're going to talk about indirect modes of transmission. Okay, so this is when the pathogens are spread indirectly through an intermediary, so a middleman, and this can be a non-living or a living intermediary. Okay, so for indirect transmission, we have several routes they can go and several vehicles that it can use. So one of the modes of transmission for indirect transmission is airborne transmission. Okay, this is when someone sneezes or talks and produces aerosol droplets that are then ingested or enter the body through another person's mouth or nose or eyes. Okay, so like this guy is is sneezing, we see the respiratory droplets that are coming out of his mouth. Okay, if you get any of these into your body, that is airborne transmission. Okay, this is also called aerosols or aerosol transmission. Okay, we can transmit disease through fomites, so inanimate objects. This would be if your friend who has had a runny nose or has a cough, coughs into their hand, wipes their nose with their hand, and then goes and opens the door to the classroom, transferring their germs from their hand to the doorknob, and then you come through afterwards and you turn the handle and you pick up those germs from the door handle. Okay, so indirect transmission can happen through vehicles such as food, water, or air. Okay, so airborne transmission, that's a vehicle. Okay, we can also transmit disease through food and water. Okay, we have our insect vectors such as ticks and mosquitoes. Okay, in the modes of transmission for indirect transmission, most of the time we see disease being transferred by the fecal oral route. Okay, this is often by ingesting contaminated food or water. Okay, this is seen a lot in organic agriculture that uses manure or feces as fertilizer instead of chemicals. Okay, and in some third world countries, not parties, they use human feces to to grow their vegetables and such. Now, if you have something like lettuce that's extremely leafy, you can go and wash it off and might not get all of the manure or feces off of it that was used to grow it. Okay, and then you go and you eat that lettuce, and you're going to ingest those feces and pick up that pathogen. Okay, so when we talk about our next mode of transmission, we need to first talk about reservoirs of infection. Okay, we define a reservoir as an animal. This can include humans, humans are part of this, or an environment that normally harbors the pathogen. Okay, so if we think about Bacillus anthracis that we learned about in chapter 1, the environment was the reservoir for Bacillus anthracis. And it was when the farmers dug it up and stirred it up into the air when that pathogen entered the host and made people sick and the animal sick. Okay, we can classify reservoirs as asymptomatic carriers. Okay, so these are going to be animals or humans that harbor the infectious agent but do not have the disease. Okay, so an example of this would be Neisseria meningitidis. Okay, this is one of the most important causes of the meningitis infection. It has no animal reservoir and is purely maintained in the human population. Okay, and it's spread by asymptomatic hosts or asymptomatic um, carriers. Okay, where the vectors are the intermediates here. Okay, so before we finish this section, we need to talk about another case history. This case history is called the third pandemic. Okay, so this case history is going to take place in 1884 in Canton in southern China. So we're going to be following the story of Yang Ding, who's a 38-year-old male who is working as a cook and is managing to support his family as a cook in 1884. Now, 1884 in southern China was a pretty bad year for disease. Disease was everywhere. Okay, specifically the disease of Shu Yi, which translates to rat epidemic. Okay, so there's lots of victims of Shu Yi. In fact, they were stacking these individuals in the streets like firewood, up to 5 or 6 bodies high, until they could be taken for burial or to be burned. Okay, so one morning during the Shu Yi, Yang Ding noticed the first sign that he had picked up this disease. Okay, so underneath Shu Yi's arm, he started to notice an area of swelling in his armpit. Okay, shortly after finding that swollen spot, Young Ding starts to cough blood, and we really didn't know what was causing him to do this at the time. So our infectious agents start to spread through his bloodstream to his lungs. But the thing is, in 1884, in the height of Shuyi, people like Yang Ding knew that once they found this swelling, so this is what they referred to as a bubo. Okay, they know that once the bubo showed up, Yang Ding had not a lot of time left. Not a lot of time left. He knew death was not far from him. Okay, in 1884 in southern China, more than 60,000 people died from what has now become known as the third pandemic of the bubonic plague. Okay, this is the same as the Black Death plague. It's caused by Yersinia pestis. Okay, so for a long time, rats were thought to be the reservoir, and the pathogens were transmitted to humans by a flea vector. Now, there has been a lot of pandemics of the bubonic plague over the last few centuries. Okay, we have the major one that occurred in Europe in the 14th century, the Black Death, that killed a third of Europe's population. We actually still have outbreaks of the bubonic plague. The latest one globally has been in Madagascar. Actually, Madagascar is kind of a hotspot for the bubonic plague, and every 10 or so years they have an outbreak of it. Okay, and that's because they have an invasive species of rat called the black rat that brings the flea vector. Okay, so the rat flea that is the one that transmits the pathogen to humans. So those black rats carry that insect vector. Okay, so we need to discuss some terms for disease. We need to know what endemic, epidemic, and pandemic mean. Okay, this will be on your first exam, as well as the modes of transmission. Okay, so an endemic disease is a disease that is always present in a community at a low rate. Okay, so usually endemic disease is found in an animal reservoir. Okay, so this could be as simple as the flu virus during the summer. Okay, an epidemic disease is one in which the number of cases increases in a community in a very short time. Okay, so if we had a flu epidemic, that means that the number of cases of the flu is going to become exponentially more than they normally are. Okay, then the pandemic is linked to epidemic. So pandemic is when an epidemic spreads globally or worldwide. Okay, we've had a lot of pandemics in the last century. So we've had the Spanish influenza at the end of World War One. We've had the HIV pandemic in the 80s and 90s. And more recently for us is the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, you do need to know the differences in these terms, and you need to be able to identify them on the test. Okay, epidemic and pandemic sometimes do get confused because a pandemic is an epidemic that has just spread beyond the small community. Okay, when we're talking about the spread of disease, we have to talk about something called a zoonotic disease. Okay, zoonotic diseases are infections of animals that then jump from that animal to a human. Okay, so in the animal that it's originally in, it may be pathogenic, so it might cause disease in the animal reservoir, but a lot of times it doesn't. Okay, so transmission is can be either direct transmission or indirect transmission. Okay, sometimes we call the indirect the spillover from animal to human. So zoonotic diseases are a lot of times just found in a animal reservoir until it does jump species and mutate so it can infect humans. Okay, so an example of a zoonotic disease is Lyme disease. Okay, and so Lyme disease doesn't cause the deer that carry it to be sick, but it does cause disease when the ticks that pick it up from taking the blood meals from the deer spill over or regurgitate that contaminated blood into the humans they're taking a blood meal from. Okay, Ebola is a zoonotic disease. Okay, so Ebola does cause disease in animal hosts like chimpanzees, but also in humans. Okay, so these are both examples of zoonotic diseases. Okay, right now we're still trying to figure out if COVID-19 was a zoonotic disease. There's a lot of speculation that it started in bats, a lot like hantavirus, but we are not quite sure if it was a zoonotic disease or not. And we're not quite sure if it is a zoonotic disease, what animal is the one that it was transmitted from as the reservoir. Okay, so animal and insect vectors also function as incubators of new infectious disease that we haven't seen yet in humans. Okay, so an example of this would be a new strain of the flu virus. Okay, so if we have two different strains of the influenza virus that infect the same animal, okay, this happens a lot in pigs and not pig farms. Okay, so what can happen is when this pig gets infected with these two strains of the flu, those two flu viruses can actually exchange parts of their genomes with each other, and it's going to make a brand new, never before seen strain of that virus. Okay, and sometimes they might not be very infectious, but in some cases it could be infectious and deadly, and more infectious and more deadly than the original strains that it emerged from. Okay, and then this new strain that the pig has can be transmitted to the farmer taking care of the pig, which then can be transmitted to the humans that the farmer interacts with. Okay, so that is section 2.3. So go through and read the section summary. Sometimes you can find answers in these sections, but that concludes 2.3, and we'll move on to 2.4 next.